Let's start with the experiments that only made the generals look ridiculous and slowly work our way toward the ones where the planet itself basically filed a complaint. Number 8. The Great Pigeon-guided. In 1943, Britain wanted a beach assault weapon for D-Day, because apparently landing on a defended coastline was not stressful enough, and someone decided the soldiers also needed a giant explosive cartwheel having a mental breakdown. The Great Pigeon-guided was basically two enormous wooden wheels connected by a drum packed with explosives, and the whole thing was supposed to spin across the beach using rockets attached around the rims, smash into German defenses, and explode. On paper, terrifying. In real life, it behaved like a drunk shopping cart with access to military funding. During tests at Westward Ho in Devon, the rockets kept ripping loose, flying into the sand, and sending the entire weapon zigzagging toward observers, camera crews, and one unlucky dog that instantly understood the situation better than the engineers. At one demonstration, the Panjandrum veered off course, shed rockets in every direction, and chased people up the beach while everyone pretended this was science and not a very expensive wheel of death doing improv. The British canceled it, which was shocking because usually the military sees something explode randomly and says, "Interesting, can we make it larger?" Number 7. Project Pigeon, before guided missiles had computers. American psychologist B.F. Skinner looked at pigeons and thought, "There's our navigation system," which is the exact kind of sentence that makes you check if the coffee was normal. During World War II, Skinner trained pigeons to peck at images of targets shown on a tiny screen inside a missile nose cone. If the target drifted left, the pigeon pecked left and the missile adjusted. If it drifted right, the pigeon pecked right. Basically, the bird played the world's worst arcade game, except the prize was naval destruction and probably no seed. The weird part is that the pigeons were actually pretty good at it. Skinner demonstrated that multiple birds could be placed together, and if two agreed on the target, the missile would follow their pecks. Democracy, but with feathers and explosives. The problem was not the pigeons. The problem was convincing military officers to trust a bomb being driven by an animal that also panics when you walk near it with bread. The project was canceled in 1944, revived briefly after the war as Project Orkan, then canceled again when electronic guidance became less embarrassing. So did it backfire by exploding? No. It backfired because the military spent years discovering that pigeons were surprisingly competent employees, then fired them the moment robots became available, which is sadly the most normal part of this story. Number 6. The Bat Bombs. Project X-Ray began in 1942, after a dentist named Lydell Adams proposed a weapon that sounds like it was invented by a villain who keeps getting distracted by animal facts. His idea was to strap tiny incendiary devices to Mexican free-tailed bats, drop them over Japanese cities at dawn, let the bats hide under roofs and inside attics, then ignite thousands of little fires at once. And because many buildings in Japan were made from wood and paper at the time, the plan was horrifyingly serious. The military collected thousands of bats, designed miniature-timed firebombs, and even tested special canisters that would open in midair. But here's the part where the bats filed their performance review. In May 1943, during a test at Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico, some armed bats escaped before they were supposed to. The bats did exactly what bats do. They found shelter. Unfortunately, the shelter was under military buildings, including a hangar and reportedly a general's car, which then caught fire because the United States had accidentally airdropped arson goblins onto itself. The experiment caused real damage, but the Navy still kept pushing it for a while because the tests suggested it might actually work. Eventually, the project was abandoned in favor of the atomic bomb, which is an insane sentence because imagine being the Bat Bomb team and hearing, "Sorry guys, your flaming cave mice are no longer the craziest option in the room." The backfire here was literal, expensive, and covered in wings. And the bats, as usual, had no idea they were part of a geopolitical nightmare. They were just trying to sleep and suddenly became the smallest war criminals in New Mexico. Number 5. Starfish Prime. By 1962, The United States had reached the stage of the Cold War where testing nuclear weapons on Earth was apparently too basic, so the next logical step was detonating one in space, like humanity had finally unlocked premium bad decisions. Starfish Prime was launched from Johnston Island in the Pacific and exploded about 250 miles above Earth with a yield of 1.4 megatons. Scientists expected a big flash, some radiation data, and the usual nightmare math. What they got was a surprise electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, which is basically a giant invisible slap to electronics. In Hawaii, almost 900 miles away, streetlights went out, burglar alarms screamed, telephone systems glitched, and people looked up at the sky, glowing red and green, like the apocalypse had hired a lighting designer. But the real damage was in orbit. The blast injected high-energy particles into Earth's magnetic field and helped destroy or damage several satellites, including Telstar 1, the famous communications satellite launched that same year. To put that into perspective, the military tried to learn how nukes worked in space and accidentally created a temporary radiation belt that started eating the new space age. Great work, team. You invented space weather with paperwork. The test also proved that an enemy could potentially use a high-altitude nuclear blast to attack power grids and satellites without directly hitting a city, which is exactly the kind of discovery that makes everyone sleep worse. Starfish Prime did not fail because the bomb was too small. It failed because it worked in ways people had not fully understood, which is sometimes the scariest version of success. The experiment ended, but the message was very clear. If you punch the sky hard enough, the sky punches back. Number 4, Operation Sea Spray. In September 1950, the U.S. Navy decided to test how vulnerable an American city might be to biological attack, and instead of using a model, or a deserted island, or literally any option that did not involve civilians eating breakfast, they used San Francisco. For 6 days, a Navy ship cruised near the coast and sprayed clouds of Serratia, marcescens, and Bacillus globigii into the air. At the time, these bacteria were considered mostly harmless stand-ins, which is what every disaster says right before the lawsuit music starts. The particles drifted through the city, and military researchers estimated that almost every one of San Francisco's roughly 800,000 residents had been exposed. The goal was to see how wind, fog, buildings, and normal city chaos would spread a biological agent, and the answer was very well. Congratulations, horrifying note taken. Not long after, Stanford Hospital reported an unusual cluster of Serratia infections, including the case of Edward Nevin, who died after the bacteria infected his heart. Whether Operation Sea Spray directly caused his death has been debated for decades because proving one invisible cloud did one specific infection is maddeningly difficult. But that is also the problem. The Navy released microbes over a real city without informed consent. Then everyone had to argue later about how much damage counted. It was not the only open-air test either. During the Cold War, the military carried out many similar experiments across the United States, using supposedly safe tracers, because apparently the best way to protect the public was to secretly spray the public and take notes. When the details became known years later, people were furious, and rightfully so. The experiment backfired because it turned a defense study into a trust grenade. Even if every scientist involved believed the organisms were low risk, the public learned an important lesson. If someone says this is for your safety while standing next to a secret spray nozzle, maybe start walking the other way. Number 3, Edgewood Arsenal. From the 1950s through the 1970s, thousands of American soldiers were sent to Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland to participate in chemical warfare experiments, and many were told they were helping test protective gear, equipment, or military readiness, which sounds noble until the protective gear is you, the equipment is your nervous system, and readiness means a scientist watching you lose the ability to describe colors. The substances tested included nerve agents like sarin and VX, riot control chemicals, hallucinogens such as LSD and BZ, incapacitating agents, and experimental compounds with names that sound like passwords made by a stressed robot. Some volunteers knew they were being exposed to chemicals, but many later said they did not understand the risks or were pressured by military culture to cooperate. You were a young soldier, a man with a clipboard said, "Sign here." Your options were not exactly endless. In one set of tests, Soldiers were given BZ, a powerful deliriant that could cause confusion, hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, and behavior so strange that observers filmed them like confused zoo animals in boots. Other tests measured how long troops could perform tasks after exposure. Because apparently watching a poisoned man fumble with basic instructions was considered valuable data and not a giant red flag wearing a lab coat. Years later, veterans reported chronic health problems, psychological damage, seizures, depression, and memory issues. Lawsuits and government investigations followed, and the Department of Veterans Affairs eventually acknowledged that some participants had been exposed to dangerous substances. But for many, records were incomplete or classified for years, which meant proving what happened to their own bodies became another battle after the experiment was over. Edgewood did not backfire in one dramatic explosion. It backfired slowly. In medical files, nightmares, and veterans trying to explain that the army they served had turned them into test equipment. That is a special kind of betrayal. The kind with forms. Number 2, Project Iceworm. In 1959, the United States built Camp Century under the ice sheet of Greenland, which was publicly described as a polar research base and privately treated as the opening act for Project Iceworm, a plan to hide hundreds of nuclear missiles beneath the ice within range of the Soviet Union. The idea was to dig a massive network of tunnels, move missiles around on rails, and make them almost impossible to target. Basically, a secret nuclear subway under a frozen island, because regular bad ideas were apparently too warm. Engineers carved trenches into the ice, covered them with steel arches, buried everything in snow, and even installed a portable nuclear reactor to power the base. For a moment, it looked like humans had bullied Greenland into becoming a missile closet. But ice is not a wall. Ice moves. Slowly, quietly, constantly, like a very patient landlord coming to evict you. The tunnels began deforming much faster than expected. Roofs sagged. Walls squeezed inward. Machinery had to be removed, and by 1967 the camp was abandoned. The missile plan never became operational. Partly because the ice sheet was basically chewing the base shut, and partly because Denmark, which controlled Greenland, had not exactly agreed to become America's secret nuclear garage. Very small detail. Tiny diplomatic oopsie. When the base was abandoned, workers removed the nuclear reactor, but they left behind diesel fuel, wastewater, radioactive coolant, and other waste sealed under the snow, assuming it would stay buried forever. And forever, as it turns out, is a bold word to use on a warming planet. Modern climate studies suggest that melting ice could eventually expose the waste in the future, turning a Cold War experiment into Greenland's worst time capsule. Project Iceworm backfired because the military tried to hide nuclear weapons inside a moving glacier and seemed genuinely surprised when the glacier did not respect the floor plan. The ice did not explode, it just kept moving, which is somehow ruder. Number 1. Castle Bravo. On March 1, 1954, the United States tested a thermonuclear bomb at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And this was supposed to be a controlled experiment, which is adorable because the bomb was named Castle Bravo and immediately behaved like a dragon with a math error. Scientists predicted a yield of about 6 megatons. The explosion produced 15 megatons, making it the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated by the United States. The mistake came partly from lithium-7 in the fuel, which was expected to be mostly inactive, but instead joined the party and produced extra neutrons, because apparently even atoms can ignore the meeting notes. The fireball was enormous, the crater was over a mile wide, and then the fallout cloud climbed into the sky and drifted over inhabited atolls that were not evacuated in time. On Ronglap, people woke to white powder falling from the sky. Children played in it. Some thought it was snow, which is one of the most horrifying misunderstandings in modern history, because tropical islands do not get snow. They get consequences. Within hours, people suffered nausea, burned skin, hair loss, and radiation sickness. The Japanese fishing boat Daigo Fukuryu Maru, or Lucky Dragon No. 5, was also showered with fallout about 80 miles away. Its crew became sick, and radio operator Ikichi Kuboyama later died, becoming a symbol of the nuclear age's habit of finding bystanders. The contamination spread through fish, coconuts, soil, bodies, and future generations because radiation is not polite enough to stay in one decade. The Marshallese communities were displaced, studied, promised safety, moved again, and left dealing with cancers, birth defects, and land that could not simply be washed clean like a bad countertop. Castle Bravo backfired because the experiment did not just exceed expectations. It exposed the arrogance behind the expectations. A secret calculation was wrong. The wind did not care, the ocean did not care, and real people paid for a test they never volunteered for. The military wanted data from the biggest blast it could make. What it got was a glowing lesson in what happens when humans build a sun, drop it on an island, and act surprised when daylight becomes poison. And the worst part is that the island did not end the experiment. It became the experiment instead.